Friends, on November 10th, a Russian warship was attacked. In Tuapse, maritime drones attacked the ports, damaged the Russian ship, and there is video footage of the explosions. Ukraine continues to cause blackouts on Russian territory. In Voronezh, 3 missile strikes hit CHP-1, leaving part of the city without electricity and water. An oil refinery is on fire in Kazan. In Crimea, there was a series of explosions at the Gvardeiskaya oil depot. Russia is burning and going dark. Its energy sector and navy are under attack. We will discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone
good health. Roman Grigorievich, what is happening in Tuapse since maritime drones attacked the port and a Russian warship?
Well, at the very least, the direction of the strike was towards Tuapse and Novorossiysk. The Russians' coastal defense was active, including in Novorossiysk and not just in Tuapse. An alert was declared for maritime drones at the very least. Most likely the attack targeted both ports after all. What has been confirmed so far is an attack by our BEC, an unmanned boat on a Russian warship. In other words, one of the headquarters will report on the damage soon, but our BCs traveled several hundred kilometers and completed their combat mission. Tuapse is one of the ports. It's one of the 2 ports in that area that service Russian Black Sea Fleet warships. And of course, the tankers that are loaded there with both dark and light oil products, including crude oil. Since the Tuapse plant is directly an oil refinery, it is located right on the coast. And by the way, one of the piers is its deep water pier, where it can load up to 80,000 tons of oil products. So for us, it's important, of course, to neutralize this port and continue striking it so that it will finally be put out of commission. Because recently drones entered there, we've talked about this before, airborne drones, and we discussed how several ships, or rather vessels, of the Russian Shadow Fleet, as well as the pier itself, were hit. And now strikes have already been carried out directly against Russian warships.
Roman Nikolaevich, you just said that Novorossiysk might have also been attacked. So, the port of Novorossiysk could also have been targeted last night?
That's correct. They were carrying out combat missions, unmanned surface vessels and possibly underwater ones as well. That's exactly how the surface vessels operate. They can also control underwater ones, acting as relays. The fact that the Russians blocked off, or at least announced they were blocking off, an alert in the port of Novorossiysk suggests that Novorossiysk was also involved.
Roman Yurievich, how often do missile carriers now go out into the Black Sea to launch missile strikes? If we compare now, say over the past 6 months, how important is it at this point to keep attacking the port of Novorossiysk on a permanent, ongoing basis?
We need to keep pressuring them constantly, whether they go out or not. We have to keep the pressure on simply because these are military ships, and naturally they are military targets for us. Whenever we get the opportunity, we naturally need to put pressure on them from different positions using various means: submarine, surface, and air assets. It all depends on what works out. Recently, the Russians have started using caliber missiles. Why? Because the use of air-launched missiles has decreased. The Tu-95 is already falling apart, and so is the Tu-160. They're afraid to send them up for these missions. It's not just that they're afraid, it's also that the aircraft's service life is used up when launching a missile. There's no point in using a strategic missile carrier for that. But using ships, for example, to launch calibers does make sense, and of course they will keep using them. And it's not just the Russian Black Sea flotilla. We shouldn't forget about the Caspian flotilla either. There are also several carriers of these caliber cruise missiles in the Caspian, and in principle they can reach at least the left bank and the central part. Ukraine. So if we're setting a task for our strike assets, we need to target both flotillas, the Black Sea and the Caspian.
Roman Lvovich reports say that besides Tuapse, there was also a strike in the Rostov region on the railway station in the Republic's area. How do you assess our strikes on railway junctions and stations?
It wasn't on the station itself. The strike was near the station. It's an interchange in the Rostov region, the Rostov railway junction. There is a large fuel depot there, which mainly stores diesel for Russian locomotives. Recently, the Russians have started using diesel locomotives to transport military cargo after our strikes on electrical substations, on the traction substations that power the Russian railway tracks. That's why, for us, it's important to cut off their main logistics, and that means precisely destroying these targets, specifically fuel terminals of this kind. And there's also one located near the railway station in Magadan. That's why it doesn't make sense for us to waste drones on the railway station there. The only thing is, when approaching the target, the Russians since they do have some air defense, might shoot down the drones, and then the drone debris or warhead could fall anywhere. Well, that's the handiwork of the clumsy Russian air defense. That's their problem.
As for Kazan, the petrochemical plant there is on fire. A serious strike was delivered. It was reported that drones attacked the petrochemical facility and a fire suddenly broke out. The authorities claim it's technical work, but it's already clear that drones were involved. Roman Grigorievich, the floor is yours, but we mean the Russian authorities when we say this. And
today there was quite a serious attack, more than 100 drones. At the same time, it was a combined attack. Simultaneously, BECs were operating in Novorossiysk and Tuapse. Our aerial drones carried out the operation, breaking through the Russian frontal air defenses. At least according to statements from the Russian General Staff, several dozen drones were destroyed in the Bryansk, Belgorod, and Kursk regions. This is precisely the direction north toward Moscow and east through Voronezh, including toward Kazan. That is, most likely there was a breakthrough of the frontal air defense with the help of several dozen of our decoy drones. We use decoy drones to penetrate Russian frontline air defense systems. These cost, well, a board with an engine costs $200. The Russians spend aviation resources on them, launching helicopters and planes, including missiles that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the right approach in this sense is for several strike drones, for example, to get through, reach Kazan, and carry out their mission. First, the frontline air defense is breached, and then if you get past the front, beyond that, there's basically nothing in place. The Russians don't have enough point air defense systems to cover all 17 million square kilometers of Russian territory. This is Russia's Achilles heel in this regard. In the past, having vast distances was an advantage, maybe in the last millennium, when you could just run behind the Urals, as they say, and not care about anything beyond that. But now that's no longer the case. Now, any point in the Russian Federation, all 17 million square kilometers can be reached. And drones, not just from Ukraine, but also from Kazakhstan, Alaska, Mongolia, or even China, depending on the mission, or for example, from our tankers, or rather from tankers and cargo ships passing by, can also carry drones along the Russian border. So there are plenty of mechanisms. And Kazan, of course, even though it's over 1,000 kilometers away, it can also be reached. Today's mission was accomplished. Petrochemicals, or rather the chemical industry, is very important to us after the oil and gas sector because practically all Russian petrochemicals, of course, are based on hydrocarbons. In other words, this is an additional second or third stage of processing the main assets of the oil and gas sector, which is why it's important for us to reach them, especially since some of them are used specifically in petrochemicals and are also used for the production of explosives, for the production of military equipment. So of course, it's important for us to hit a double target here to accomplish a double task. That is to destroy both the economy on one hand and on the other hand, military production.
Ukraine continues to be precise, creating blackouts and chaos throughout Russia. The Voronezh TPP-1 took 3 direct missile hits, turbine blocks were destroyed, and part of the city is without power. Roman Igorovich, how do you assess the strike on TPP-1? Because at first, it was reported that in the Russian city of Voronezh, electricity went out, then water, then heating. And it was reported that preliminarily 3 missile strikes hit TPP-1 in Voronezh. The first hit struck the outer part of the boiler building, the second pierced the roof and destroyed the foundation of the building, and the third struck the heat generation room with the turbines where the key energy nodes are located.
They don't want to pay reparations, they don't want to leave our territory, then let them carry electricity by the bucketful. At least they'll learn. They carried 2 buckets of electricity, carried them off. Let them learn in this kind of situation. And the strikes, for example, will naturally be like waves, so-called carpet bombing from our border. Whatever we can reach, that's what we'll destroy. Mirror strikes. This is what happens when the Russians ask for a mirror strike. They destroyed our energy sector back in 22, destroyed petrochemicals in 2022, and we were left without a single oil refinery. The same thing will happen in response. Not a single oil refinery, not a single extraction station will be left. We will cut off all the pipelines they use to pump gas and oil and their products, including light oil products, plus energy infrastructure of various kinds. In other words, mainly their energy sector. Just like they struck us, all our thermal power plants have been wiped out. We have practically no thermal power stations left. That means the Russians won't have any either. And at that point, no one will be shouting or whining about any laws of war. They're just mirroring exactly one-to-one, just mirroring. Naturally, it's whatever they can reach. They've reached Voronezh. Well, of course, the first to come under attack will be those 5 regions bordering Ukraine. For now, it will still be limited to Ukraine because most likely we will eventually return these regions to the Ukrainian state. These are our lands. That's Bryansk region, Kursk region, Belgorod, Voronezh, and Rostov. All the way to Kuban, we'll have to see. Maybe even the Krasnodar territory will have to be included a bit. Well, we'll lay those out as reparations. But at the moment, of course, they are the first to come under attack. Since they are located along the border, they are mainly targeted by drones and missiles. There is a certain range of our missiles that can reach them. The basic one being the Neptune, which has a range of 300 to 400 kilometers, and that's the one that's mostly used. After a Neptune strike with a warhead weighing several hundred kilograms, it's unlikely that any Russian thermal power plant will be able to start up or restart quickly. That's why it's important for us right now to fund exactly these kinds of developments.
Roman Igorovich, the energy situation is difficult. Center Energo reported zero generation over the weekend. Everyone is reporting that we are facing prolonged power outages. Russia is striking thermal power plants with ballistic missiles very accurately. This is a horrifying situation. There are reports that Ukraine could experience prolonged power outages of 8 to 12 hours daily. There is serious damage to substations, and the Trypilska and Zmivska thermal power plants have been shut down. Unfortunately, according to Ukrainian energy workers, it is impossible to quickly restore generation. Roman Grigorievich, why do Moscow and St. Petersburg still have electricity? We remember President Zelensky, who said there would be blackouts in key Ukrainian cities. There would be a blackout in Moscow, and as we understand, in St. Petersburg as well. Why can't we achieve this at the present moment?
Moscow's air defense right now, in terms of its density, has 3 or 4 different layers. So this multi-layered defense doesn't allow aerial targets to break through. You would need either hundreds, almost up to 1,000 drones aimed at a single point to exceed the saturation threshold of this air defense, or you would need ballistic missiles. But when it comes to ballistic missiles, we've been hearing announcements for several years. Yet for some reason, no one is bombarding Moscow with just announcements. Well, or rather, maybe they've tried sending videos, flooding it with video clips, but what you really need there are ballistic missiles. And what's most interesting is that even May barbecue ballistic missiles won't do the trick. So what we really need are ballistic missiles. The Russians won't be able to assemble the ballistics. Well, not all of it, at least. Some of it might get through. And only after we have our own ballistic missiles, only then will it be possible to create a BLK specifically in Moscow. And for us, it's especially important to be able to reach Moscow. The decision-making center, the metropolis that has seized the colonies, those colonies are specifically the 21 republics of Russia, which are directly Moscow's colonies. And these republics will definitely be clapping their hands when there will be a blackout specifically in Moscow. When they have to use buckets for toilets, not just Putin's little suitcases, but any toilet or any elevator, then they'll remember Donetsk. They'll be going into elevators. What else can they do? You can't carry it with you everywhere. There won't be anything to flush with. That's why for now, we can't accomplish this particular task because we still don't have the capability to produce ballistic missiles. I don't know where they are, what stage they're at, but we've been getting these announcements for 2 years now. In that time, they could have built 500-kilometer ballistic missiles 3 times over. So it means the executive branch needs to be replaced. You don't need for that. You don't need any kind of political battles to replace it because replacing the executive branch, the cabinet of ministers, can be done in 24 hours. You just take them all, send the entire administration to the territorial recruitment center, that is to the TRC and then to the front, so that they can experience firsthand what they've been sending others to the front to endure for the past few years, and then bring into the cabinet of ministers people with a basic military education and a clear primary objective. The main objective, by the way, General Zaluzhny articulated it very well, is our primary task, victory. That means restoring territorial integrity, which is extremely important, and not some disguised capitulation under the guise of peace agreements, which is exactly what our current cabinet of ministers is doing at the moment, all this sneaking around. But in reality, of course, first of all, we need to change the objective, to shift the paradigm from one of capitulation to one of victory, to bring in people who are committed to this goal of victory, specifically those who can define it and know how to. And after that, we'll have ballistic missiles and there will be a blackout in Moscow. Without a doubt, we will also live to see Lenin removed from the mausoleum and sent to a hut near St. Petersburg.
Roman Igorovich, what's the situation in Gvardeiskaya? The temporarily occupied Crimea, a series of large-scale strikes, and the oil depot in Gvardeiskaya has been attacked. What can you say about this?
As for Crimea and Novorossiysk, we can use drones and aerial targets there as well, which, by the way, we have plenty of. How many of us pro Flamingo? They're already talking about it. Flamindi chat. They almost intercepted it, but it got away. They say the Flamingo managed to escape so far, at least. In other words, cruise missiles, eventually, I think it's worth putting them on the wing, since funds have been allocated by the people. And in principle, you can enter Crimea with aerial targets. Why? Because the Russian fleet has been driven back to Novorossiysk, and their air defense is positioned ahead. Meaning at sea, the Russians practically have no air defense. So you can go in and carry out combat missions. That's basically what our special services are doing right now. So mainly it's aerial drones and missiles, including cruise missiles. At the very least, the Neptune is operating there. Why? Because this falls under the jurisdiction of our Navy, our naval forces, which in their basic configuration have the Neptune coastal missile system. And this missile is now not only surface to ship, but also surface to surface. And strikes, for example, on oil tankers, storage tanks, and various types of oil storage, light petroleum products, dark petroleum products, they are being destroyed. Recently, strikes have been carried out, we discussed this before, on Feodosia, where they did a good job burning down that oil terminal. And now they continue to target Gvardeiskaya, where there is also a large base that needs to be completely burned down. There are still a few tanks left there. I think our specialists will finish burning them, but military facilities have no place in our Crimea.
Roman Lvovich, do you see any systematic key efforts regarding the temporarily occupied Crimea that could possibly lead to its deoccupation in the near future? Or is this being done to cut off supplies to the enemy's southern group? So what is the purpose of us striking Crimea and the enemy's military facilities there so intensively today?
Well, in the near future, we definitely can't expect Crimea to be deoccupied yet. What do you mean by near future? Are we talking about months until it could be done in a year to a year and a half if the intensity of the strikes is serious? Not like it is now. It needs to be increased along with the number of means of destruction. That is, these need to be cruise missiles capable of striking military targets, reaching all the way to the Kerch Bridge. To reach the Kerch Bridge itself, you already need ballistic missiles. It's important to understand this clearly because the air defense density around the Kerch Bridge is the same as in Moscow. Naturally, it's almost impossible to break through it using aerial targets alone, either underwater or surface-based, or unmanned boats or ballistic missiles. Then it would be possible to take out the Kerch Bridge as well. This is just to clarify the process. There are more than 150 stationary military facilities there, and if you keep hitting them, eventually, as the saying goes, knock and it shall be opened unto you. You have to knock hard enough so that the Russians run away from there. It's a matter of time and the means of destruction. Not in the immediate future, but this is already systematic work to destroy Russian, first of all, enemy air defenses, at least in Western Crimea. We can see this clearly. Radar stations, anti-aircraft missile systems, launchers, and so on. Such things are subtracted, and after that comes a wave of destruction targeting military facilities which themselves can burn. Why have drones started targeting Russian oil depots? Because, say, a military facility buried in a rock somewhere, how are drones supposed to break through there? Not every missile can even reach it. But an oil depot that's sitting right on the surface, it's practically asking for it, so to speak. That's what they're targeting now. I used to think we'd eventually see a change in executive power, that normal people would come into production. We'll wait for our ballistic missiles and then we'll finish off Crimea. Although, of course, Crimea needs to be liberated in two waves. The first is air and missile strikes, which should also last for several months. Specifically, planes, and missiles. And only then, after we've eliminated the Russian troops in Crimea, will ground operations begin. And right now, of course, the Russians' logistics are still being destroyed. Military equipment and ammunition that comes through Crimea to the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions. So it's very important for us to cut off this supply line.
Roman Ilyich, Nabusa is conducting a large-scale operation to expose corruption in the energy sector. Over 15 months, detectives collected thousands of hours of audio recordings and documented the activities of a high-level criminal organization. Today, the entire internet, all media and social networks are buzzing with this information. Operation Mairos. NABU is releasing the first tapes in the case of illegal embezzlement in the energy sector. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a full-scale war, Russia's invasion, an energy crisis, and attacks on the energy sector. So there is the war, and then there is this terrible corruption. What do you think?
War always brings corruption with it, but the real question is how to counteract it. In normal countries that are at war, corruption is punishable by execution. Literally by execution. I mean, it's pure looting. Just like looters are lined up against the wall, in wartime, people are lined up against the wall for corruption too. In peacetime, that's not an issue. You judge according to international law, so to speak, without the death penalty, but now there should be a death penalty article. Until that's introduced, corruption will persist. This is where the most terrible, the strongest corruption lies. As soon as the first dozen are executed for corruption, believe me, it will immediately die down. So this is a direct question for the lawmakers, but they won't execute themselves, and that's the problem. That's where the root of it all comes from. So now at this point, we can simply observe this entire process unfold, or we can state the fact very clearly. What new information have we actually been told here? That we have corruption present within the economy? Yes, of course, it exists and is a reality. This is especially true and becomes even more apparent when it comes to the energy sector, where such issues are often more pronounced and visible. That is practically the cheapest electricity, the very cheapest is nuclear power. But everyone has piled onto it, and the population relies on it, meaning on subsidies. And on top of cheap electricity, they've also piled on so-called green energy. Because a kilowatt hour of nuclear energy costs 2 hryvnias, but for some reason green energy costs 7 or 8. So the question is, why do we even need this green energy? Back in the day, Kliuev, under Yanukovych, brought in all these contracts. Just imagine, those old regionals, even now, this whole thing with so-called green tariffs is still going on, and they're 3, 4, even 5 times higher than what the nuclear plants can supply us with. This whole thing is still spinning around, and it's pure corruption. Green energy is, in its purest form, a corrupt scheme. Now, all of this is handled by Ahmet Rinat's companies. They're the ones mainly involved in this whole business. Kliuev handed everything over to Renat Folk. Back in the day, during the start of the war in 2014 to 2015, we still have this big problem to this day, including in the energy sector and in the army as well. It's not going anywhere in the army. In the Ministry of Defense, in our cabinet, that's why I'm saying we need to replace the civilian cabinet of ministers with a military cabinet of ministers. A cabinet of public trust. That's how we need to work. And there, of course, the task should be to execute corrupt officials. That's actually where we need to start. The fight against corruption begins with the execution of corrupt officials, with a law on execution. Otherwise, there will be no fight at all. Otherwise, in the end, they'll just find a way to get off the hook. Well, all these Mindiks, all these Zuckermans, they'll just run away to Israel. How are you going to get them out of there? They have Israeli passports in their pockets. They don't hand over their own, so to speak. That's it. End of story. It was exactly the same situation back in 2014 in the isolation ward when I was tortured by the Israeli Evich. He also had an Israeli passport in his pocket. And they boasted, saying, "What are you going to do to him? He'll go to Israel and you'll never get him out of there. Only a special operation to eliminate him would work." Well, something like that. There's no other option.
Roman Grigorievich, there was an explosion and fire at a key substation in Russian Taganrog, according to military analysts. And why is it considered key, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, it's not exactly key, of course, but it's one of the main ones, yes. That is, the real key substations are those where, for example, power lines can transfer electricity at 500 kilovolts and above. 500 to 750 kilovolts are considered key. All those below that level are at least an order of magnitude less important. But nevertheless, why is the Taganrog direction so important for us? It's logistics. In other words, it's precisely an attempt to cut off Russian logistics that go through the Rostov railway hub. And this is exactly the route. Rostov, Taganrog, Mariupol, Rostov, Taganrog, Volnovakha. That's basically how it is. So it's absolutely important, of course, to eliminate completely anything that could help the Russian military move in that direction of the Eastern Front.
There are reports that the Flamingo missile produced in Ukraine is better than the Tomahawk in the United States. How much do you agree with this statement? That's what military analysts are writing, and The Independent, the British newspaper, is publishing it.
It's like saying, well, my car is the best in the world when I buy it. Well, when I finally get it someday, then maybe it will be the best. And it's the same story with the Flamingo. It might be better too. The Tomahawk, when it appears. For now, we don't see it. Well, not just in a few prototypes, but in serial production. Because the Tomahawk, after all, has thousands produced. And that's why a Tomahawk is called a Tomahawk even in Africa. As for us, we have the Flamingo, but as I understand it, it's somewhere vacationing in Bali. So yes, in warm places, maybe Mindik has slipped out of Ukraine, and instead of going to Israel, he'll return these so-called Flamindas, these Flamindicis, back from Bali, and maybe they'll fly somewhere eventually. But for now, at this moment, since there is no serial production of these missiles, there's really nothing to talk about. And in reality, of course, the missile itself is actually quite decent for accomplishing its tasks. Well, not global or strategic ones. After all, it's a cruise missile, which means it's a good ARS, a good target for Russian air defense wherever it might be located. And missiles of this kind, if they weigh several tons, then in principle, they simply cannot be supersonic by definition, which means any supersonic interceptor will catch up to them and destroy them. What matters is having them in large numbers. Only then will it actually be better than the Tomahawk. Why a large number? To exceed the interception coefficient of the Russian air defense system, both frontal and point defense during combat missions. It can be produced. The big question is, why doesn't it exist yet? That's the problem here. Why can it be assembled in a makeshift way? Well, it really can be. You take a simple aerial bomb. We've already explained this to you several times, step by step. An aerial bomb, FAP 500, FAP 1000. You roughly wrap it in some kind of tube, add a straight wing, a supersonic engine, and off it goes, up to 25 tons of thrust. And the 25 series flew on it. I personally flew it. I have 1,500 flight hours. It's a very good engine. Thousands of them were produced and are just lying around in warehouses now, no longer needed. They've used up their service life. Restore them, and you end up with a missile that costs about $100,000, not 500 or 600,000 like theirs. They're trying to push Firepoint into our budget. This missile could cost about 100,000, but not more than that, because even the L-39, which is also a several-ton aircraft. Back in the day, I used to send my planes to the Kharkiv and Crimea regions. They were ferried there. At that time, L-39s were being sold there for $50,000. Well, let's say it costs 100,000, even if it's been modified to that level, roughly as a missile. But you just need a lot of them, and then these missiles will actually have some effect. For now, all we can do is talk about it. Is it better? Is it worse? Well, for example, how is it better? Range. Well, let's say yes, 3,000 kilometers. The AI-25 engine could push this missile 10,000 kilometers, if only there was enough fuel. It's just a matter of having enough fuel for the climb. For 3,000 kilometers with its 0.7 consumption rate, you need about 2 to 2.5 tons of aviation kerosene just to push it that far. But it can make the distance. So the missile initially launched. Not a bad idea, actually. It could have been made on the fly and put into mass production. To this day, it still hasn't been done, and now this whole Firepoint is scattering in all directions. Why? Because from the very beginning, there might have been a corruption angle. I've already explained in simple terms, you could skim at least 5 cents off each missile if they made it for $100,000. So there are a lot of questions. Like I said, they should be shot. We should already be putting up walls and executing them. There are simply no other options.
Roman Nikolaevich, as we record this stream, new information has arrived that a substation near Jankoy in occupied Crimea was attacked. What can you say about this?
That substation, I think it's 300 kilowatts. It works for power transfer, meaning through that substation, it was possible to supply all of Crimea from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It's the Swedish line that comes in from Melitopol to Jankoy, and from there can distribute electricity throughout all of Crimea. So it has enough capacity for the main consumers, but it needed to be powered from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. For us, it's very important to cut off this option. That is, so that the Russians don't even consider starting up the nuclear power plant without our control. Strikes on this substation are precisely aimed at achieving that goal.
Roman Ilyich, and of course, before we finish, I can't help but ask you about the main topic, the situation in Pokrovsk. General Syrski has stated that we have plans A and B, and that the situation is difficult, but for example, the General Staff has also made a statement. They denied the information that the Russians have full fire control over the logistics routes and that Myrnograd is encircled. Let's discuss the logistics of Myrnograd and Pokrovsk and the situation at the front.
You could say there's a kill zone about 10 to 15 kilometers wide. Obviously, all the logistics chains are under attack from Russian drones and from our drones as well. So it's basically a continuous gray area, a kill zone, call it whatever you like. As for Pokrovsk and Myrnograd, those who say you can just stroll around there without a care, don't believe it. That's simply not true. Of course, there's also no encirclement there, despite what Putin, Gerasimov, and all that Moscow crowd have been boasting about, trying to pull the wool over everyone's eyes. In fact, along the entire front line, there's no place where Russians have managed to encircle us. The only encirclement is near Dobropilya, where several hundred Russians are still stuck in those pockets, and our assault troops are finishing them off there. I believe it's the first corps of the National Guard of Ukraine, the National Guard, operating there. They're specialists in clearing operations, honing their skills there. So the objectives are being carried out because the Russians failed to create any pockets in Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk. But the situation is extremely difficult. Nothing has improved there, that's for sure. For things to get better, at the very least, one side needs to be unblocked, the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration. They allowed it by acting as a buffer. They allowed Russian troops to cross the highway to Kostiantinivka and put the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration under threat of encirclement, partial encirclement, operational encirclement, you can call it whatever you like. It just hasn't been closed off. They still haven't managed to fully encircle it, thanks to us. They were not far from closing the encirclement. But the gray zone, that is the kill zone, with drones, it definitely exists and is controlled by the Russians, but also by us to some extent. The situation is extremely difficult right now. In fact, the situation in Benhart is even worse than in Pokrovsk. Until we unblock the Northern Claw, and it is possible to unblock it. We need 2 full corps there. The 7th Corps of our airborne troops is already operating there, but it needs to be reinforced or, for example, filled out with more personnel. We have transferred the 1st Corps of the National Guard there, but even there, it's not at full strength. We need to transfer the entire unit. And even better, integrate the National Guard into the armed forces of Ukraine so that Syrskyi doesn't have to command a patchwork of different units. Just imagine, there you have the National Guard, the National Police, Border Guards, the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Special Operations Forces, drone units, the main intelligence directorate, and the Security Service of Ukraine. And all of that is under Syrskyi, and he has no direct control because the SBU reports to Maluk, the National Guard, National Police, and Border Guards report to Klimenko. To the Minister of Internal Affairs, well, directly subordinate. Who does the main intelligence directorate report to? I'm sniffing. The most interesting thing is, well, that is, we need to clearly understand that Syrskyi has a problem there. In order to solve it, all these security agencies need to be part of a unified command system within the armed forces of Ukraine, so that we no longer hear about the National Guard, Police, Border Guards, the Intelligence Directorate, or whatever else. The Intelligence Directorate should generally be part of our General Staff. It should be the Intelligence Directorate of the General Staff, not the Ministry of Defense, so that they report to Hnatov, not to Shmihal. Otherwise, it turns out that Shmihal is the one carrying out combat missions. I just feel sorry for the guys because they really are high-level specialists.
Dear audience, please like this video and write in the comments how you are doing, how your homes are, if you have electricity and heat. Roman Svitan and I are sending you rays of kindness and light. Ukraine will definitely endure and win. 3 times a week, we record interviews with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you. As usual, see you this Wednesday. Thank you.
Goodbye.